Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to this special edition of Instruction Discussion, where we examine recent trends and developments in education and their impact on the districts around us. Today, we welcome Mr. Jared Sams, who is a self-taught artist who creates impactful graphic novels that channel his hip hop and punk music influences to help children develop unique skills, passions, and creative influences. His latest project, Black and Blue, is a story of two African American brothers who grow up with different views. Dante becomes a community activist, while his brother Jackson becomes a police officer, all in the midst of the racial strife of police brutality and Black Lives Matter protest marches. I'll give you a quick preview of who he is and what he does. And of course, we are also pleased to have joining us this evening in this discussion, New York City Council member Adrienne Adams, representing District 28 in Queens. Welcome to both of you to this special edition of Instruction Discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on, man.
Oh, no, it definitely is our pleasure. And I know that there is very timely to have this discussion as well with everything that has been going on recently. But before we get into that part of the discussion, Jared, I want you to describe your book a little bit. I talked about just in the introduction there that it is about two brothers who go on divergent paths. But if you can give us a little bit more background into what your book is about, and as well as what made you decide to write this book now?
Yeah. So yeah, Black and Blue is a graphic novel. It's for grades 6 to 12, and we wanted to make something that I guess was now. You know what I mean? That took advantage and looked at the world that was unfolding around us and tried to tell a story within that context, and like personally, my reasons for making the story, for writing, drawing the book, was, after the George Floyd stuff and the footage was on top of, other events of 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017, so on and so forth. I just start feeling had all these emotions: anger, frustration, just despair, you know what I mean? You start feeling all these things. And so for me, the book was a way to help kind of work through all those emotions and feelings. And it was also, it was created in the spirit of trying to help others as well, right? A conversation starter, something that, like it did with me, help you kind of like also read the book, and students read the book and understand, like, okay, what am I thinking in this moment? Like, what am I feeling, and how do I process all this stuff? So that's kind of where I came across in trying to create this book.
Okay. And how do you think that this novel can actually be incorporated into school curriculums for middle and high school students?
Well, I think kids are smart, right? Like, they're super smart, and they see the world that's outside, right? And they probably have questions. They have questions not only about the world and what's happening, but also where they fit into all this. And so I feel like the book it meets them where they're at, right? We're all sort of students of, not just the classroom, but of life, right? And so there are constant things that are kind of like inundating us, right? That we have to that students, young people are trying to grapple with. So I feel like introducing a book like this into the classrooms is a good, like I said, a good way to meet them where they're at, like to not run away from the realities of the world around us, and try to allow teachers and faculty and just, educators to like I said, engage with students and talk about things that may be despairing and may be uncomfortable in some ways, but to do it in a way that's productive and again, engaging.
Now, Councilmember Adams, I want you to be able to ask some questions of Jared directly as well. But before we get to that point, I have a question for you. So can you talk a little bit about the Education Equity Action Plan, as well as the importance of implementing a K to 12 Black Studies curriculum in New York City?
Absolutely. And thank you again, Kevin, for having us on tonight. This is such a timely discussion. Jared, I compliment you and congratulate you on this graphic novel. Very, very exciting. So in the FY22 budget for the New York City Council that we passed last month, the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus, of which I am the co-chair, advocated for, and we received $10 million for what we call the Education Equity Plan. So we worked very closely with a coalition of leading Black educators, including David Banks, the president and CEO of Eagle Academy. We also worked with the United Way of New York City and other organizations on this proposal. So I'm a member of the City Council's budget negotiating team, and I took on the responsibility of negotiating this into our budget for the council coming into the year 2022. What the Education Equity Plan does is it creates a commission that is charged with producing and implementing a comprehensive kindergarten through 12th grade Black Studies curriculum, not to be confused with critical race theory, all right? This curriculum is going to teach the history and contributions of African Americans before slavery and acknowledge the contributions of ancient Black society and their impact on the world. So this action plan impacts all children, all right? So we want all children to know the contributions and the history of African Americans in this country. The action plan also incorporates professional training for teachers to successfully implement this curriculum. So we're very excited about it. We're excited about this commission that will create this new curriculum in our city's public schools and the impact that it's going to have on our children. It's especially relevant for what we're talking about today in ensuring that our Black students see themselves in textbooks and in lessons and in the classroom. This is a crucial first step, and I'm really proud to have advocated and secured the funding for this curriculum. For those that don't know, education is at the heart of my life's blood. It's just very important that we make a tremendous impact on the children of New York City, far beyond today, but for generations to come.
I know that in New York City, the Department of Education has had this big push in the last couple of years to get more culturally responsive education. And that's been the buzzword around the education circles lately: culturally responsive pedagogy, education, curriculum. So how can, or is, well, therefore, I believe that the Education Equity Action Plan is really kind of a part of that, or kind of born out of that idea that will help, as you say, put more books and images and stories where where students can kind of see themselves in a mirror. So it kind of puts a mirror up in front of them as opposed to a window, so they can really see themselves in the curriculum and therefore take more, be more engaged in it.
Exactly, Kevin. It's so important what you just said. We have seen over the years what happens to children of color and their psyche by not seeing positive images of themselves in history and also in fiction. We have to continue to create positive influences for our children. The positivity, though, is already there in our history. We've just never been able to tell it before because the powers that be have such fear, and still do, as we know, have such fear of the realization of who we really are, who we come from, what we've done, what our ancestors have done. And there is a really such a stark fear there. And just looking at the way some of these things are playing out right now in this day and time, for me, it's such a shame that it's been okay to tell everybody else's story and know everybody else's history, but all of a sudden it's a real problem when you want to tell a Black person's history. So I just think that, it's high time that we stand up for this curriculum because, again, This is not just for Black children. This is for all children. All children will benefit from the history and the culture and the knowledge of knowing who we all are in this country.
Exactly. Now, this question I'm going to put out there for both of you actually, but I want to start with, I want to get Jared's perspective first, and then Council Member Adams, I want to get your perspective as well, because in the graphic novel, Black and Blue, there is a disconnect that forms between the two brothers, right? One of them, like I said, became an activist. The other one becomes a police officer. So first, Jared, how do you envision, or how have you envisioned these rifts and tensions played out within our communities? And then Council Member Adams, I want you to answer the same question.
Am I all right? Cool. Just make sure I wasn't on mute there. Sorry for that. Yeah, I mean, like, essentially, no group is a monolith, right? Every group, is full of, like what a council member was just saying. Like, it's important to understand there's a rich history and a rich culture that isn't just in lockstep, right? Like, there's all these different images and viewpoints, perspectives, amongst the Black community. And so for me, with this book, it's essentially about how do you bring about change, right? Like, it's about wanting to change the world you're in and realizing there's no one right way to do it, right? And allowing all of us to give us the room and the space to really kind of express how we want to change the world, how we want to go about and bring that change. You think about the 60s, you think about the civil rights stalwarts, someone like, Martin King Jr. and Malcolm X, they definitely had very different approaches to how they wanted to do civil rights, right? But they were still both dedicated to helping people, to helping the community, helping Black people. And I feel with our book, Jackson, the Black Lives Matter activist, and his brother, or Jackson, the police officer, and Dante, the Black Lives Matter activist, they are both very dedicated to the idea of justice, right? In the Black community and interacting with police, but they just have different ways of going about it. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That dialogue, that discourse, that's what leads to equity, right? To finding a way to some kind of equilibrium or to something good, right?
So, Councilmember Adams, building from that, what have you seen in your travels in representing your district, how those relationships and tensions have developed and how they're being dealt with?
Yeah, they're, in our communities, they're just very, very high tensions, in our communities in general, because the relationship is historic. It's a historic relationship, and it's one that's always clashed. We've tried, to incorporate partnerships between police and community, and we're still doing that. Quite frankly, in Southeast Queens, I think we do that very well, actually, compared to other places in the city. But there's still work to be done, and to Jared's point and his book, the themes, in the book are topics that young folks, especially, and our families continue to deal with today across the board, whether it is systemic racism, injustice, or the relationship between law enforcement and communities. All of these are such relevant issues that we're still grappling with, especially after the murder of George Floyd, and the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, which I think was absolutely, the powder keg that set everything off in that fateful summer last year. But these are very difficult conversations that we have to have. The importance is that we have to have these conversations with adults, teenagers, with tweens, with youngsters that understand and that are questioning exactly what all this is really about. Young folks in our communities have a feeling. about policing. They have a feeling about it. They may not even be able to communicate what that feeling is, but unfortunately, in too many cases, the feeling is a negative feeling. So we're going to have to start engaging more on a basic level playing field. The police department is instrumental in teaching and mentoring. And that is what we need to show our young people. This is what we really need to do, is bring that partnership more into. We've got the explorers out here that do tremendous work in our communities. I was out with them. They had a great picnic last weekend, and rock climbing, mountain climbing, and barbecuing and everything. This is what they love to do with the children. We've got weekend activities now where they engage in basketball tournaments and all kinds of things to bring the youth in, to show them that this should really truly be a partnership instead of an us versus them thing, where the relationship is so antithetical. It's so messed up for so many reasons. There is a barrier that we're going to have to break through, and it's called systemic racism. It's nothing to take lightly. It's something that we're going to have to bash through. I chair the Public Safety Committee, and I say to, the commissioner and anyone who will listen to me, we've got to bash that thing through, and we've got to start running from it, because it is a reality that our communities are facing. So we've got to look at it head on, and we've got to break through that systemic racism that has caused so much harm and continues to do so as we speak, Kevin and Jared, as we speak on this very night. It's going on right now in the streets, of the city of New York right now. We have to break that thing up.
And so how do we, let me see how do we actually balance, therefore, this movement for police reform and the need for public safety? Because we know that we want to definitely have the people who are guarding us and protecting us to actually also respect us. And at the same time, how do we develop a respect for them?
Yeah, I'll take that, and then I'll let Jared, give his remarks as well. This is one of the biggest issues facing our communities right now, especially across the communities of color in this city. We can't deny that we've seen a spike in gun violence and shootings in New York City, particularly in communities of color. We've also seen a troubling rise in hate crimes as well, and high-profile crimes happening in our subways on a daily basis. All of this is happening while we're in the midst of a killer pandemic. And that's why public safety is top of everyone's minds right now. And at the same time, we know that we have to reform policing in New York City to make it more fair, transparent, accountable to the communities that our law enforcement serves. So in the New York City Council, for example, we've passed a slew of reforms over the past year. NYPD hasn't particularly liked it, or particularly liked me for championing this stuff, but it's gotta happen. It's gotta happen. We passed groundbreaking legislation in March that gave us the end of qualified immunity, which is a huge topic right now. New York City is the only jurisdiction in the country to have passed this law to end qualified immunity right now. It's never done before. The legislation also includes my own bill that requires the NYPD to track and report all traffic stops. It's never done before. We know who gets stopped, but we've never seen the data on who gets stopped. So my bill actually mandates NYPD to break down data on traffic stops by precinct, age, race, and ethnicity. So now we'll know who's truly being stopped, and we'll have the data on that. So we've done a lot already, but there's so much more to do. But that's how we're going to move forward. We've got to make sure that our communities are safe while we are respecting the rights of everyone, to your point, Kevin. So these goals are not mutually exclusive. We can have public safety while also making the necessary reforms to strengthen the relationship and trust between law enforcement and community. And I just think that we just have to engage and communicate a lot better than we've been doing, and realize that it's something that we all want. We all want to be safe in safe neighborhoods. Everybody wants that. The question still is, how do we get there together? And it's through transparency and accountability.
No, that's amazing. I could Councilman, or Councilman, I could hear you talk all day. You got my California vote. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure if that means anything, but from California, you have my vote.
Thank you.
I mean, everything you said was just so on point. I mean, like it's like these events, like, you know, the relationship between, you know, policing and Black communities, it could be like anger inducing, you know, and anger is good fuel, but it's not an engine, right? So it's important, I feel, for us to like, to not only know what we don't like, but what we do like, right? To like, to really advocate for, you know, the kind of policing we want to see in our communities, and to know, to do like, we communicate with the police by telling them, you know, stop doing this, but we need to communicate with them as well, saying, but do this, you know, and do this. And it's important for us to be able to voice our needs and to communicate those needs to the police and to, you know, politicians, to anyone who will frankly, quite frankly, listen, because otherwise, you know, otherwise it's easy for them to write us off. It's easy for them to kind of write the story and say, oh, they're just crazy, they're just talking, right? But, you know, I feel like the more we sort of hone our thoughts and our ideas in a productive way, in a helpful way, like, you know, for this book, for me, in creating it, like I said, it was all these emotions going in my head, but the act of actually putting it on paper and writing a script out and really thinking through what I want to say, it helped me understand policing more, helped me understand the situation better, and it helped me understand how I can, you know, potentially go out there and do some good. And, you know, the hope is students, when they read this book, they'll feel the same way.
Now, there was a particular line in the book that I really found compelling. And Jared, the last time we actually had a conversation about this a while ago, but I want to bring it up again because it was really compelling. And the line goes, I love this country, son. It's my honor to serve, but I don't fight for what America is. I fight for what it can be.
Mm.
So is that the type of discussion point that we really should be having within our Black and brown families, and that we should be having with our children? Because we know that, well, why should we fight for a country that doesn't love us? Why should we love a country that doesn't love us back? And that's the refrain that a lot of people have been having. So should our focus therefore be not for what America is, but what we believe it can be? And either one of you can begin with this answer.
Well, I'll say that, you know, I think what we forget about America is it's a place of change, right? I mean, like, you know, the founding of America is about someone looking at what was happening or what the world was and wanting to change it, right? Like, you know, Civil War was about change. Civil rights was about change. You know, this is a country that is historically, that's what we do, is we're constantly changing and making this country better. And so the way I see it is, you know, we're continuing on that struggle, right? To this day, we're continuing on that struggle, you know, and you know, sometimes we've talked to classrooms about the book, and, you know, we'll get questions from the kids, and one of the questions from one of the kids was, you know, I don't like that cops have guns. You know, I don't have to like that police have guns. Why do they have guns? And, you know, obviously, you know, he's talking to a sixth grader about why police have guns. You don't have the time, or, you know, I can't explain to him the whole ramification, the whole reasoning for that, right? But what I could tell him was, you know, you have the power to if you don't like that police have guns, you have the power to educate yourself and to maybe change that, or to find a way to mitigate that, or you know, it's like that we live in that country where that's possible. And so, you know, it's easy to go cynical, I think, when you look at the news and you look at the world. But I think, like I said, historically speaking, we've seen that this is a country that can change for the better, but also for the worse. So it behooves us to engage with it as much as we can, and yeah, and just kind of be there and fight the good fight.
Yeah. Yeah, Jared, you said something really, a couple of times. You used the word historical, and that's the first thing that came to mind for me. When the question was asked, history. Once again, our children have to be trained on what their history is. Can you imagine the tides that will turn if our children knew who they were, who their ancestors were, where they truly came from? This conversation, I think, might be moot at that point, where a child would say, why would I love a country that doesn't love me? This child has to first love himself or herself first. So that comes from home. So if parents are teaching, if they're not teaching it in the school yet, we're on our way. But if the parents are teaching our children who they truly are, who you come from greatness. You come from kings and queens in this world. And you must love this country because your ancestors built it for you to love. So I come from that premise, that historical premise. My ancestors built this place for me. I'm going to love it and I'm going to make it better in spite of the obstacles in my way, in spite of who other people may look at me and assume I am. I know who I am, where I came from. And guess what? This is mine. So, I just come from that kind of a standpoint. This is mine. I'm not going to let you take it from me because I built it. You tried to steal it. It didn't work, and it's still mine.
I think that's a really important concept to remember, that you're fighting for what's yours. You're fighting for
Yeah.
what other people have fought to give you, and so you want to, and of course, you want to make it better. The job and the goal of every generation is to make things better for the next generation coming. So that's, I think that's a really important distinction to make here. Um, what would you recommend? And this goes to you, Councilmember Adams. What would you recommend as far as students, parents, and families to help to strengthen that relationship of trust between the police and community?
Yeah. Get involved. Truly know the capacity of law enforcement. Again, we come back to history. We've got to know, where the history of law enforcement is in this country. Once we know that, then we can kind of understand some of the foundation that's already been built. That's already been built as far as creating these relationships. And then we've got to move on because, like you said, and like Jared said, it's about change. It's about changing this thing. And we can do this. Like I said, we have pretty good relationships in Southeast Queens with law enforcement. We've got pretty good communication spaces in our community precinct council meetings. There's great attendance by law enforcement at our community board meetings, at our civic association meetings. So we have to continue the dialogue and the communication. We have to let each other know what our issues are, be honest about it, be civil about it. Instead of being, we always see these fighting situations, these bickering situations. And that's again becoming a point of, reform, when it comes to, how things are really set in stone, the infrastructure, if you will, of these departments. What the leadership says usually is how things will flow in a particular precinct. So if we have the leadership speaking the language of inclusion, speaking the language of communication when it comes to the community, then that's going to filter down into the ranks, and the ranks will understand, we've got to change this. We've got to build bridges, instead of building fences and walls. Mm. So it's just going to behoove us to continue to have those communication sessions, draw each other in on our differences and our similarities, because bottom line is law enforcement has families just like the rest of us have families. Law enforcement now in New York are particularly minorities, if you will. So there are people of color, in those ranks in larger numbers than we've ever seen before. So we have more in common then there are differences between us. The only difference is that, you know, there is a particular mandate, you know, that enforcement has to do, but you've got to keep us safe while making sure that our integrity is intact in our communities. So that's the piece that we have got to marry.
And Jared, I know that the basic reason that you created this book was to begin the conversation, to begin that dialogue. But I think what we also need to point out to our listeners, everyone here, is there's some really, really stark imagery in the book as well. I mean, you are a very skilled and accomplished illustrator, because I think your background is cartooning, and so you have a lot of vivid imagery that you bring to life here within the graphic novel itself. So how do you hope that how do you see this book being used by educators or even by families to help begin that conversation?
Do you mind if I share some art real fast?
Oh, please.
Yeah. Let me right. The future marches on, and I am trotting along, unfortunately. But here we go. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
All right, cool. So yeah, I mean, like, so for me, especially with graphic novels, cartoons, art, it's important to just be as visceral and immediate as possible, right? You want to use colors, you want to be expressive. You just want to grab, especially young people, right? Students, you want to grab them. Like our first page of our book is this. Our first 2 pages, our opening is of a protest gone awry, right? And you know, again, I think it's important to be honest with what's happening, right? You can't really, it's not even a matter of sugarcoating anything. It's just a matter of looking, like a lot of these images I actually pulled from reference photos, from pictures, from news footage, you know? And so it's important to, when you're communicating, to be honest, right? Like any relationship, right? Any relationship needs communication, and that communication has to be honest. So whatever change is going to happen, whatever, you know, kind of resolution might come, it has to come from a place of truthfulness, of understanding what the situation actually is. So like, you know, for me, I just feel like there's a lot of assumptions being made by police officers, by the community they police, about, you know, everyone, right? A lot of assumptions about who they are. One of the things I was surprised about in kind of getting this book out there to the world is a lot of the police officers who read it, they applauded what we're trying to do, right? They applauded this book. They liked what we're doing because they, you know, they are also sick of what's happening. They also want to see a change, right? And so I think it's important for us to maybe, and it's hard to do, right? But it's important for us to be able to, you know, even when someone's at their worst, to maybe assume, to still hope for the best, right? To still hope that you can reach someone, and hope that it's not, like I said, not grow cynical, and hope that there's no point, right? Like, you know, you keep those lines of communication open, even if it does seem like no one's listening, because I guarantee you someone actually is listening, right? And so, yeah, that's kind of where I fall on a lot of that stuff. And here, I'll take off the art here.
That's quite all right. So let me see. Because now we come from the conversation surrounding race and police relationships and so forth, and we also know that there's this thing called a school to prison pipeline, based on the number of suspensions that students receive and where they're going to go, what their likelihood of them graduating as opposed to going into the prison systems and so forth. So, Councilmember Adams, just talk to us a little bit about restorative justice and what types of those practices should we really be encouraging within our school systems and among our students?
Yeah, it's such an important issue. I think that, you know, for our children, again, they need to see themselves in the education process. Um, as far as, you know, restorative justice is concerned, we have to have, and we have to get a lot more creative than we've been when it comes to ensuring that our children are taken care of. The system across this country, systems are not set up in the favor of Black and Brown children across the country. And it's set up, you know, and I hate to look at it through this prism, but in too many cases, it really is set up to have our children fail. It's set up in that we don't have equity when it comes to, for New York, for example, for the gifted and talented programs, there's no equity there. For the, you know, the SHE-SAT testing to get into, we call them the elite high schools, there's no equity there. You have to know someone, and you have to know someone with money, and you have to know someone that is going to tutor your child to make sure that your child gets the education to take the test, that the education that they're not getting in school, where this education to take the test, if we still want to do the test, the education should come from the schools to be able to make sure that our children are educated to take those tests, just like everyone else who can afford to have the mentorships and to have the tutoring and to have the special courses to enable them to reach that higher echelon in those particular high schools. Again, if we want to keep the test. And I'm not saying whether we should or we shouldn't, but if we should, there's got to be equity across the board. So for me, restorative means equity across the board for our kids. We've got to take a look at it on an even playing field so that we won't have to have these terms of judgment. We won't have to have these terms of placement and displacement for children of color, that we'll be looking through one clear prism. Again, I'm going to tout our curriculum that I think is going to help a lot of this, you know, in the future for our children, especially here in New York, in New York City. I think that we've got a lot of good things to look forward to as far as the future of our children, because people are finally listening and realizing timing is everything, you know, and everything is cyclical. You know, again, the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, the protests coming about, everything else that's come out of this movement that is still moving. So many things have been shaken up through this movement. Jared's written an extraordinary book because of this movement. We've enacted police reform because of this movement. Children's lives will be changed through the educational process, through this movement. Police reform is happening through this movement. And I think that's something that we need to speak more about, what this movement actually means and how it really has moved us and will continue to move and propel us into higher spaces than we've ever seen before.
Jared, you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, Councilmember
I know
Adams.
you see. I know you seem so mesmerized by Councilmember Adams' words, and,
I know, right?
Understandably so.
Yeah,
but I didn't know
like,
if you had anything you wanted to add.
you ever ask me a question like, "Oh, that's right, I'm here too." I was just listening. I was just into it. But yeah, like, you know, the idea of the equity action plan, I think, is amazing. And like, I just want to say, like, in terms of just like, you know, restorative justice, like, I think part of it also is a psychological effect, right? Is understanding that, you know, that like you matter, right? And like, I think part of that is, like I said, the Education Equity Action Plan, the idea of like a lesson plan or curriculum that really kind of helps students and young Black and Brown students understand that, you know, they have a place in the world, they have a future, right? And they're part of that future, they're built into it. And so, you know, and like, so, like with this book, like all the things I do, but this book especially, you know, it's important to tell stories about, you know, like Black families, right? Like not just like, you know, not, you know, just about Black families and strong characters that, you know, that you can be, right? That, you know, like that struggle, that persevere, that triumph. But it's important to tell these stories. It's important who you cast as the kind of the key to those stories, right? The protagonist. Like, I come from a pretty rough drug neighborhood, right? But I had like a really loving, supportive family unit, right? So like I never felt the need to like, you know, pick up a gun or, to do it. I didn't feel the need to go a certain route just because I was my grandma was a teacher, it's ingrained in me that, and I was encouraged to use my energy to express myself and to fight for a future that I was, like I said, that I was part of. And so part of, kind of like bringing all that together, part of moving forward with that sense of justice, that sense of fight is having people fight for that justice, fight for that future. And part of that is, in my mind, being able to allow children, students, young people to express themselves and to find ways to express themselves and to know that that means something. It's not just some like hindrance or crutch or whatever, or weakness. It's, learning about yourself and knowing who you are is a good way to plant your flag. So yeah, that's meandering there.
Now, Council Member Adams, do you have any questions of Jared that you would like to ask as well?
Only, I mean, in thinking of the book, we're talking a little bit about your inspiration for the book. I would just like to hear more, to hear you expound on that inspiration a little bit more. Clearly, the timing again was perfect for it, but if you could just elaborate more on your inspiration, because it takes a lot to actually put a thought, to make a thought into something that you created. I can have a thought and I can sit here and have another thought and think a million of them in a day, but I'm not going to be inspired necessarily to write a book. So if you can expand on your motivation and everything that made you say, hey, really, I've got to like put pen to paper and make this thing have life.
I will say, Councilmember, I can't kick the copious amounts of butt you're kicking. So I mean, like, we all have our talents, we all have our skills.
Bless your heart.
But I think that's what's important is, right. I met someone like you looks at the world and says, I can help. I want to help. I want to be of service. And for me and my skills, a book like this is that's me saying, I want to be of service. I want to help. How do I do something like that? And that's what this book is, right? It's just something that I think it's kind of two-pronged. I think like just in terms of what Black and Blue is, it's something that I'm hoping not only helps, obviously talking about, there's a racial component to it, talking about, Black Lives Matter movement, George Floyd, like police violence, like there's a lot of immediacy in terms of what's happening in the world right now, what's been happening. But also I think there's like a universal sort of aspect of like, we live in a very divided country, and so a lot of households are divided, a lot of people are divided. So making a book that's kind of ultimately about reconciliation, it's about the steps and process of trying to reconcile what's happening between people. It's like, you love someone, you have a brother, and you guys don't agree, but you still have to live together. You're still brothers, you know what I mean? So how do you kind of like come through through that, right? How do you guys stay together? How do you respect someone you disagree with, right? So I think that's also a very kind of like important part of the book, right? We all have our differences. So like, how do we sort of respect those differences? How do we respect those differences, right? And so in terms of motivation, that's definitely part of it. That's, something that is important to me, but also just the art of it. I'm a big fan of art through advocacy. So I think it's important, again, like as I was saying, just it's important for my aunt. She had to say, I won't say the exact saying, I'll paraphrase it, but she said, brothers just don't dream anymore, right? And, that always stuck with me, right? Because I think it's important that we know that even though the world tells us we may be, you know, this is our lot, this is who we are, we don't have to listen to them. We can be whoever we want to be, right? We can dream. We can take hold and do what we want to do with our gifts, our talents. And you see a lot of, I know a lot of people from my neighborhood who just feel their God-given talents were suppressed, and they decided that it wasn't worth it, and they went another route. And it's unfortunate because, you know, I see their talent, I see them shining. I want to see them do the things that they're great at, but I said, I think that's part of it, is making something and sort of, hopefully people, when they see me and they see the book, they feel like, okay, you know, he did it. So, you know, maybe I can too. So yeah, so there's a lot of inspiration, a lot of motivations there.
So, and I'm glad you raised that and you answered the question that way, Jared, because after reading through the book, and yeah, you see the strife that has built, or the chasm that has been created among not just the community and the police, but even within that one very household between the two brothers, and how they realize that even through our differences, we still have to figure out a way to respect each other and with those differences. So while the book talks about the strife and the tensions, where do we go from there? Like, where do we go from here? Where do we go? We recognize we have these tensions. We recognize we have the strife that's going on. We recognize the differences. So what are the next steps that we can take once we begin these tough conversations?
I think, so like I was just saying before, like, anger, emotion is a strong fuel, but it's not an engine, right? So I think the next step is feeling those feelings, understanding what you're feeling, and then using that as like productive action, moving forward, like what the council members doing, right? Like taking your energy, your emotion, all that you're feeling, combining it with your skills, your gifts, your talents, and using that to enact change in the world around you, right? Like to, you know, I think it's easy sometimes to feel like you're not making change, like that, like, you know, you're a pebble in a pond, right? Like what can you possibly do? But I think but I think that's bunk, right? Like it's not true. Like, you know, we see historically and every day we see just people making differences, whether it be in their life, in their community, in the world. Like, you don't have to go big; it could just be very small. But I think the next step is just realizing that your actions, your motivations, all those things, they matter, and to take those things and to, like I said again, try to figure out what it is that you want to change, right? Like, that's so important. It's just understanding, like, you know, what am I trying to make what I want to make a difference, what's that difference, and how do I get that to that difference? I think that's the next step, understanding all that stuff. And so, like, you know, books like Black and Blue and other fantastic books, check out Life Switch Learning. They're my publisher. They make a bunch of just amazing culture relevant books as well. And it's just a matter of just finding, there's so many books out there, so many resources out there that can not only help you sort of like feel like yourself, you know, feel good, feel like I can make a difference, but also kind of help you maybe start on that road of the difference you want to make.
Councilmember Adams, where do you think this conversation continues as far as with students, their families, and just the people in general, community at large?
Yeah, we have to keep talking. You know, these conversations now have become more relevant than ever before, and we have to keep them going. We can't stop until we see, you know, exactly what Jared just said, the change that we're looking for. In a lot of situations, though, the change we're looking for lies within ourselves. So, my thing is always to plug in, you know, plug into your resources, plug into your community. Everybody was put on this earth with a passion and a purpose. And it took me a long time to find mine, but one of my favorite phrases now is, I get up every day on purpose with a purpose, because I know what my purpose is. And a lot of people don't know what their purpose is, and they'll never know what it is, but it takes plugging in. It takes throwing off, whatever those things are that we fear the most. It takes throwing that off. And it takes, having the strength, the courage, and the faith in yourself, to go on and just, strike out and launch out. For some are waiting for somebody to tell them what they're here to do or bring them what they're here to do, instead of seeking out that thing that is already in them that is for them to do. So, so my advice is to get out there, get out of the four walls, get plugged into your community, figure it out because it's already there. So it's just going to resonate. It's going to resonate, within your spirit. It's going to resonate. That thing is going to spring up, whatever it is. Believe me, it's going to spring up. Even if you try to run from it the way that I did, it's going to find you and capture you because your spirit is going to come home to yourself. And it's already there. So you've got to get out there, plug into your community. As Jared said, read those books. One of those things that I was doing when I was out there protesting last year was I was screaming Black Lives Matter, but don't you dare forget that Black books matter. We have white folks that want to know your history, and they are breaking down the doors of the bookstores of Amazon right now to figure out who you are. Even if you're not trying to figure out who you are, other cultures want to know about Benjamin Banneker. They want to know about Charles Drew. They want to know about Harriet Tubman. They want to know about Cicely Tyson. Yes, and right now they want to know about Aretha Franklin. So we have to know, from whence this greatness comes, because all this greatness is a part of the great us. So get out there, know yourself, know your community, and you will know the love and the compassion and the passion that is put in your heart that you were already, as one of my best friends said, age, don't ever worry about it because you were born with it. You came here with it. You might not realize it right now, but you will if you seek that which you have already been born with.
Amen, amen, and
I'm going to
amen.
stop preaching now.
we go and pass around the virtual collection plate to everybody who's watching this right now. But before I do continue, and we do have a few more moments before we begin to wrap up, I want to ask you, Councilmember Adams, how do you see a book like this graphic novel, how do you see it playing out in the curriculum that you are proposing?
Wow, as being a very integral part of this curriculum, of knowing, the parallels and the paradigms in the Black family, in sibling relationships, in the things that we're taught. We can come from one household, yet be totally different people, which a lot of us see that in our households right now. But those paradigms play out on a daily basis. So Black and Blue, for me, would definitely be required reading in this curriculum in getting to know thyself, know your neighborhoods, know your parents, know your social circles, know the people that, as Jared said, the people that were put in place to nurture you, the stories that they have to tell you, how that creates the person that you are. So all of those things intertwined, for me, would make Black and Blue required reading.
That sounds great. And I know that there are a lot of educators and counselors who are watching and listening in on this as well. So Jared, I'm going to pose this question to you. Are there any plans to create a companion workbook to Black and Blue, or does one already exist that teachers and caregivers can use to facilitate the conversation that is sparked by the novel? We can't hear you right now, Jared.
There are like, yeah, hey, sorry. There are companion questions and workbook like questions at the back of the book to sort of foster more conversation, discussions, hopefully between educators, teachers, and students. But in terms of something maybe a little bit larger, that's something we got to talk to the publisher about, I think. But great idea, you know, like it's a lot to take in, you know, and especially when you're coming at it to, you know, sixth graders, seventh graders, eighth graders on. I think it's important to really, what I learned writing, you know, I'm not really used to necessarily writing for middle grades, high schoolers. So what I've learned is it's not about giving them the answer, it's about asking questions, and it's about putting them in a spot where they're using their own critical thinking to better understand what's going on. You know, you want them to ask questions because you as an educator, you want to be able to be like, okay, cool, let's talk. You know what I mean? And let's work through this. Let's understand this better. So so definitely a great idea. Something maybe a little bit more expansive.
Well, we would definitely like to thank our guest today. We have, first of all, we want to thank Mr. Jared Sams, who is the author and illustrator of the book Black and Blue, the graphic novel Black and Blue. We thank you for being here, as well as New York City Council member Adrian Adams, who is representing the 28th District in Queens. Thank you both for being here and taking part in this conversation today.
Super honor. Thank you. Honor being with you here, council member.
It's been terrific to have this dialogue, Jared. I wish you all the best with your book. I'm going to be talking it up. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you tonight for this really, really important discussion.
And of course, we want to be able to thank one of our sponsors, our primary sponsor, the publisher Light Switch Learning, for being the producer and the publisher of the book Black and Blue. And of course, if you do want to get information on how you can get bring that book to your school or to your community, feel free to contact the publisher directly. You see the number in front of you, and you can, and I'm sure they will be more than happy to help you out and get that book into the hands of everyone within your schools or your communities. So again, thank you all for coming in, for joining us today. Very special thank you to all of you who have tuned in. And I am your host, Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you for tuning in to this special edition of Instruction Discussion. See you next time.